Hey, everybody, it's Andrew Wilcox. This is Wander with Andrew Wilcox, a podcast about the crazy, wild ideas we think about sometimes that eventually end up turning into the things that change our world, I guess is the way to look at it. Today on the show, I've got Alexa with me. Alexa Tullett is the associate professor at the Department of Psychology at the University of Alabama. Yeah, so she's originally from Canada, originally from Ontario, from Toronto, but now she is living in Alabama, and she's learned a lot from that experience and change in culture, how much does change, how much doesn't, and she does some really cool research on confirmation bias. Yeah, the idea that we might be a little bit biased in trying to achieve what we believe and how that can affect research and stuff like that. And she also talks a lot about open-mindedness and how to be more open-minded. That's what the show is all about today. Alexa, super awesome to talk to, really interesting, and a really cool person. So let's get right to that. Here it is, my conversation with Alexa Tullett.
Welcome to Wander with Andrew Wilcox.
Alexa, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, I grew up in Toronto, or at the time it was Scarborough, and now it's technically Toronto. And I did all of my schooling sort of around there, and then when I was 26, I finished my PhD in Toronto, and then I got a job at the University of Alabama. So I moved to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I have worked at the University of Alabama as a psychologist ever since.
Wow. Was Alabama a place you ever thought you'd go?
Oh, yeah. I dreamt about moving to Alabama since I was a little kid.
Is that sarcasm or no?
Yeah, that is sarcasm.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
But I know I do like Alabama quite a bit, although I did never imagine myself living here. That's true.
Where did your passion for social psychology come from?
That's probably a question that I don't really know the true answer to. I do remember being in university, and I took a lot of physiology classes, and I always really liked that kind of stuff. But when it came to the point of delaying having to get a real job by going to graduate school, most of the neuroscience programs focused on very narrow questions, and we're talking about like neurotransmitters and this kind of thing. I was in my last year of university, I took a social psychology of genocide class, and I found myself wanting to talk all the time about the stuff that we talked about in that class, and not so much about like my biochemistry class. So that's what I ended up applying for when I went to graduate school. So I think probably some things that are a coincidence, and then also, I mean, I think I'm biased, but I think that everybody likes to think about what causes people to act the way that they do, and that's basically what I spend time thinking about all the time. So,
well, it's funny that you say that, because even I went into radio. I've got a one step above clown college diploma in radio broadcasting. But my thought process behind going into radio broadcasting was being able to talk to people and get to know and understand why the individual thinks the way that they do.
Yeah,
because through broadcasting, you get that opportunity. So I think it's a similar thought process at the beginning, but it's interesting in the way that the paths that we all take. What is the goal of your research that you're doing now, or the goal of the research that you'd like to do?
Right now, so I guess within the past few years, my research has come to focus more on the things that allow people to be open-minded, or I guess the more pessimistic way to look at it is the things that cause us to be closed-minded. And increasingly, I'm interested in the practice of social psychology as a field. And so lately, my research focuses on the combination of those two things. So social psychology, as any science, our goal is to be a self-correcting field. and a field that is sort of like moving forward in terms of the knowledge that we have about the way people act the way that they do. But there are things that limit our open-mindedness as researchers, and also institutional things that limit our scientific progress as a field. And so these days, maybe my goal is to help improve the self-corrective capacity of social psychology, I'll say.
So in a similar way to how an individual player can tank a team by wanting to be the star, or a rock star can tank a band by taking up all the limelight, a single scientist can partially tank a research by wanting to be right more than wanting to be what's right.
I would agree with that a single scientist can tank things, but I think it's more of a community effect. Like, I think all scientists they have the incentive to publish and to maintain their careers and to be successful. And the way that the incentives in our field currently work, these incentives are often at odds with the incentive to be truly open-minded. So even when people have very good intentions and their goal is to be open-minded, they're not always rewarded for open-minded behavior. So there are these institutional challenges as well.
This might seem a little off topic, but then would you not say that that's an issue that is rising in a lot of areas as people get worried about their own well-being and their own financial well-being, that they're willing to accept things that they're willing to accept things that are not open-minded in order to make sure they secure their own well-being?
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think even more sort of like maybe out of left field than what you said, I think we are often in situations where pragmatic concerns compete with our underlying values. And it's nice to prioritize our values as much as possible, but there are also you can't ask people to ignore their own pragmatic concerns, like whether or not they have a job, or whether they or not they succeed within their job. People will always care about those things for good reason.
Well, it seems like that conflict is at the core of so many things that we're seeing in our world today.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to politics, some people willing to completely forego all of their what they would see as morally reprehensible, just in order to maintain financial solubility, or the belief that they're getting financial solubility, or also completely willing to forego their religious beliefs, which are supposed to be of the highest regard, in order to maintain economic success.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I recognize those parallels as well. Yeah. I mean, I think that it is. This is a sort of a trite thing to say. I think it's sort of easy to articulate our values in abstract terms, but it's often very hard to put them into practice, and also even to recognize the situations in which it would be appropriate to put them into practice. So I think if every one of us had like a little like signal that went off in our brain when there was like something that, we were doing something that violated our values, maybe we would be better at it. But sometimes it's like not something that we're even recognizing.
But
so you mentioned politics, and I think many people are used to sort of paying attention to biases in the realm of race or in the realm of gender. We've become sort of like, I think as a society, well versed in discussing those kinds of biases. But so a person might be pretty capable of catching themselves when they exhibit those kinds of biases, but not used to catching themselves when they exhibit, say, an anti-conservative bias or an anti-liberal bias. I think that's becoming increasingly something that's discussed, but historically it hasn't been as much.
Yeah, and I think that I think also in Canada we like to kind of think that we don't have that problem sometimes, but it's definitely very apparent up here.
almost as much as I think it is in America. I mean, you would have a better perspective on that, having been in Canada and the States. Do you see a difference there between the two?
I would say so. I think that the U.S., simply because of the two-party system, that system lends itself more to like a sort of an in-group, out-group polarization types of problems. But I think the interesting things come up when you compare the U.S. and Canada as well. Like, so, for instance, when I was growing up in Canada, this is sort of like relevant to my life, but there was a really strong stigma against the southern U.S. in particular. And that was sort of like an allowable form of prejudice. Whereas I think Canadians maybe pride themselves on not being very prejudiced, and there's many good reasons for that. And I grew up in Toronto, which is an extremely multicultural place to live. And I think people are very conscious of prejudice, and I think in a way that kind of environment does reduce prejudice in very important ways. But there is still like, it's like you focus on one thing and then another thing slips through the other side, right? And so prejudice against southern U.S. citizens, I think, was like sort of something that was allowed, almost under the excuse that like Southerners are prejudiced, so it's okay to be prejudiced against them or something like that, right?
Yeah, it's
so always an interesting phenomenon to me.
It's not okay to be intolerant unless you're intolerant of the intolerant.
Right.
Essentially, that's where the line is. So thus we can make fun of everybody in the South. And I think, and this might not hit with everybody, but I think that has happened when it comes to Alberta as well. Even in Canada itself, I mean, many times I know Alberta, having lived inside and outside of Alberta is looked at. I mean, we've called ourselves, and we've had other people call Alberta the Texas of Canada.
Right. Yeah, right.
And the rednecks with the trucks in Canada, and then people make fun of the others. I make fun of Toronto on the other end as the people who are self-centered and only think of themselves as the center of the world, which is is the sentiment over there. And I think sometimes in Canada we also like to think of ourselves as more inclusive than, say, America, and a good portion of at least the middle of America. But then I think we also do have a lot of underlying issues when it comes to our Aboriginal people that we like to ignore as well.
Right.
And it seems to be a part of a human need to have somebody to point at that we're better than.
Yeah. I think that's a sort of like a very common motivation, something that maybe is part of human nature, to want to see yourself in a positive light. And one sort of like cheap way of doing that is to compare yourself to other people in a way that makes you look better. And even if it's not necessarily accurate.
But do you think that might have something to do with the reason why politics has risen to such a us versus them, my sports team, the left, versus your sports team, the right? Because we have had less of that sort of like our ability, society's ability to kind of go, oh, those people across the ocean, they're so much different than us. We are a better democracy than they are. And now we're starting to realize more and more that there isn't that much difference, and that our democracy isn't always necessarily better than across the pond. So now we're like, oh, well, who's the group that we can look at? Oh, well, now we can look at politics. That's something we can look at, that we know that you can't really get mad at me for that. I'm not racist if I don't like your politics, right? Do you think that that's developed because a lot of the other things have gone, like we've proven that wrong to think that way?
Yeah, I see. So it's like a remaining domain in which it's like more permissible to have these like in-group, out-group dynamics, or like have, I do think that there is something about the way people think that sort of defaults to comparison and maybe even competition. And so I think a big part of constructing our own identities comes from constructing that identity in contrast to something else. And that's something I think that, again, becomes sort of salient when you think about Canada and the U.S. I think because the U.S. is such a big country and because Canada and the U.S. are so closely tied and physically close, the Canadian identity is often constructed in contrast to the American identity.
Absolutely.
And so I think it is a difficult challenge to try to construct the identity of a society or the identity of an individual without having some kind of contrast. And then, the simplest version of that contrast is to see yourself as on one team and see other people as on another team, whatever categorization system that might be. And I definitely agree with you. I think that's a really good point, that there are some categorization systems that are sort of out of fashion in terms of allowable ways to compare yourself to other people. But politics, I don't think, has yet become one of those.
Yeah, and I think people lean on it now more than they ever have because of that. Because they haven't been able to form their group. And also too, probably looking at it in a good way, it's that all of our cities and stuff have become more multicultural.
Right.
So it's harder to form, I think, racist biases for the individuals because they've been thrown out the window by the people that people have been able to meet.
Right.
I grew up in a community that was, when I was young, very white, and there was a lot of very racist. I hate to use the term race. Very ignorant people that just didn't have any understanding of other races, and now it's very different. My nieces and nephews now go to a school with very multicultural classes. They think in very different ways when it comes to race, just because of the way that they've grown up. And I think that's a positive. So this might have developed out of that option being taken away, but it might also have just developed out of the fact that people are growing up in a different way now, and that just doesn't make sense to them to be racist, but they're still looking for identity, and they're looking for the group to be a part of, and as you said, somebody to reflect that from.
Uh-huh. And I think that there might be actually sort of valid reasons to think that it's more okay to have this kind of competitive dynamic along the lines of political orientation as opposed to things like race or gender or things like that, because theoretically people choose their political orientation, right? Yeah. So you are free to adopt the political values that you want to adopt, and so if somebody chooses to criticize you for those values, I think it does maybe deserve to be in a different category than prejudice along these other dimensions that are, they're not chosen values.
Yeah. So that brings me down to the big question. The reason I wanted to speak with you: how do we be more open-minded?
Yeah, that's a question I think about a lot, and something that I think is very challenging. So, maybe one of the first steps to being more open-minded is, I think, to recognize how challenging it is to be open-minded. So I think we quickly get into traps when we take small steps or try to see things from a new perspective. And I think these things are good, but then think that we've solved a problem and now have become open-minded people. There are things about the way I think that the human mind work that make it impossible to be completely open-minded in the sense of being willing to equally entertain any possibility. And that's fine, right? It's totally reasonable that we're more likely to entertain, sort of a plausible explanation for why something happened than to entertain the possibility that aliens did it. There are good reasons to weigh different accounts differently and to not be equally open-minded to everything. Also we have a tendency to sort of stick with whatever thing we previously believed or believed first. And that's an extremely difficult tendency to overcome. And again, sort of going back to what I was saying before about like, maybe if we had like a little signal that went off in our mind, every time we were supposed to exercise open-mindedness, we might be better at it, but we don't, right? So you don't like have a sign that you don't have something that like notifies you when you are tending to look at, let's say, more liberal news sources than more conservative news sources, or when you're sort of like identifying the flaws in a research study that conflicts with your previous views, but you are letting those same kinds of flaws slide in a research study that supports what you previously thought, right? So those are things that are going to happen that are basically impossible to avoid, and we're not always going to detect them, right? Like a lot of these things are sort of going on in the deeper reaches of the mind, if you want to think about it that way. But I don't think that means that the problem is totally intractable. And I think one step towards becoming more open-minded is simply to become less sure of yourself. So while I don't think that, I don't think it's realistic, and I don't think it's necessarily desirable to be sort of equally open to all possibilities, I do think that things become problematic when we are overconfident in our views. And in the political realm, I mean, to get a concrete answer to a question that's politically relevant is extremely difficult. Like, you could work on one political problem for your entire life and not be 100% certain what the correct answer is, right? So for instance, like if you're, I don't know, curious about whether we should have the death penalty or not, right? You might have a moral stance on that, and that might be sort of like an easy way to come to a quick answer to that question. But if you want to sort of weigh all of the pros and cons of having a death penalty, like that is a massive, massive question. And so it's, I guess, in my personal experience, being somebody who does empirical research on the way people behave, one thing that I think I've learned in the time that I've been trying to do this is that it's extremely difficult to come up with answers to these questions. And so just to have a little bit of humility about how much we can really be sure of these things, I think might be a good step towards being more open-minded. And that humility is very warranted. Like, I think you'd be very hard pressed to come to like a conclusive answer that would persuade anyone in the domain of politics, for instance.
Yeah, it becomes near impossible to change a person's view on a lot of political stances, especially the big ones that do a lot of the dividing in most in most societies. Like you can't,
right.
To change a person's view on something like abortion is very tough to do,
right?
And that's a very tough discussion to have too. So. Yeah, that was very tough. And when you say like we don't have an alarm that goes off when we're doing something against our moral values, we almost have the exact opposite in cognitive dissonance, where it's stopping us from being open-minded. We have a safeguarding our own emotions and feelings from feeling stupid and feeling wrong.
Right.
So how do we as a society correct for that? Can we?
Yeah, again, I mean, I think the seemingly simple answer is that we could examine our own thoughts and stop ourselves from doing that, and I think that's misguided. Like I was sort of saying before, I think a lot of these things happen very automatically, and they're not things that are apparent to us. But there might be behavioral things that cause us to be less likely to do these kinds of things. And one might be just exposing yourselves to a broader range of views. I think the best way to do that is to interact with a broad range of people, So I mean, this can get tricky, but I think a lot of people don't like discussing politics, for instance, with people who have different political views than them. And sometimes there's very good reason for that. Like sometimes those conversations are really unpleasant. But if it can be very easy to surround yourself with people who have very similar views to you. And I think that's a barrier to open-mindedness. Times when I think I've changed my mind on important issues are times when I've become friends with people who have very different views than me, and like over time seriously entertained the views that they have. I don't think that's the kind of thing that can happen really quickly. Like, for instance, in the States, if you like just read Fox News headlines once in a while, I mean, sometimes that kind of thing can even backfire, right? If you're not like really engaging in good faith with this like alternative position that you're exposing yourself to, and sometimes that can even make you sort of more entrenched in your original views. But yeah, if there are ways where you can interact with people who you respect, who have different perspectives than you, I think that's one way to prevent yourself from sort of like staying in this bubble.
I had that
echo chamber.
I had that exact experience you just described. In order to try to see all sides, I signed on to like Fox News Twitter, just because I was like, I think I'm not getting the whole story all the time. I'm going to put Fox News Twitter on there too, so to kind of add a little bit of other views in there, and it drove me crazy. I couldn't handle the headlines. That was the problem. The headlines to me, I'm just like, that's not true. That's just straight up not true. Nope. And it's exactly what you're saying. It reinforced for me. I'm like, nope. Totally Fox News, write it off. I try every once in a while to watch some of the clips just to sort of try to get the other side. But I just find a lot of its aggressiveness really tough for me to watch. What's his name? The one guy, Shep. Is that his name? The one guy I like. The one guy I can watch, but for most, like, I can't handle a Tucker Carlson clip, even if he was describing to me how cute a duck was. He'd probably do it in a way that was so aggravating to me I couldn't even watch it.
Right. Yeah.
But I see what you're saying, because that's always my worry, is that I'm getting into the liberal silo, and that seems to be what, with social media the way it's designed, in order to be convenient and comforting to us, is it's creating that issue more than anything else. So the question is, do we change that? Do we have to change the way social media works? Is that even possible? Or are we at the whim of technology?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, and actually it's something that you could imagine different kinds of algorithms for the way that, for instance, like Google decides to give you your news, or Facebook decides to filter your feed or whatever, that would expose us to more information that's not so consistent, right? But I suppose that these algorithms are designed to send us the things that we most want to see, and those are the things that are most consistent with what we've seen before. So I think that technology will continue to work against us in this way, unless we're really, really motivated in how we use it, and sort of like very diligent to not become siloed.
I think it's interesting. A little sort of experiment I've had a couple of times is if you ever go to a work computer that's not yours and just hit the browser and it pops up the news stories, and you sit there and you go, who the heck would want to read this? And you're like, well, that's what the average, like, that's just the base of what people would look at, because that computer is not used by the same person all the time. But you go to your own even workstation, what it feeds to me, it has learned to feed to me out of my years of working where I work, that we're in different worlds now. You just walk to a random computer and hit that screen. You're like, who reads this news? It's not designed for you, so it's not what you think it should be. But it's probably better for us to be seeing that more often.
I think one thing that can be sort of interesting about the experience of using social media that's tailored to our preferences, is that you start to realize that you are a predictable kind of person. And almost all of us, I mean, we fit into a demographic category that, things like Google and Facebook understand, and they know what to market to us and what to send to us. And that also sort of suggests, I think, that can be one way to arrive at maybe humility or open-mindedness, is to recognize that if you've become a totally predictable person, then maybe you aren't totally thinking for yourself all of the time, right? So I think it's very easy to look at whatever the other side might be to you, and think that their sort of views come in this like prepackaged homogenous form that they just sort of buy into. And it's difficult to see ourselves that way, but it's often equally valid to apply that to ourselves.
Absolutely. It's just, what we were exposed to as we grew up. I was very lucky to have an incredibly open-minded, thoughtful, and inclusive parents in a very small town that helped a lot for me. I know that. I recognize that. And I think, this is what people, I think, this is what we all have to kind of, what you probably look at more than anybody would, how much of we have is free will and autonomy over who we are as an individual. Is the big question. And that was, to me, was the big eye-opener, and the understanding that, I'm not sure what the actual combo is, but there's a good part of it that's just not in our control of who we are.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And we're much more willing to acknowledge that for other people than we are for ourselves, I think. So yeah, we'll sort of recognize those situational influences on others. But I think we tend to see ourselves as freer than other people are. But that was definitely something that I thought about moving from Toronto to Alabama. So like I said, I think growing up in Toronto, Canadians and Torontonians sort of pride themselves on being unprejudiced. And then moving to Alabama and seeing, like, at the University of Alabama, seeing the sort of like the problems that arise when it comes to race. And there have been a few scandals since I've started here. The sorority and the fraternity system are often sort of at the center of those scandals. But it becomes easy to feel like you have some kind of moral superiority, but then you think about, again, like how predictable your perspective on this would be as somebody from Toronto and from Canada. And it's very simple to explain those differences in views by differences in environment. So it sort of puts a check on getting too high and mighty if the views that you're high and mighty about are the ones that everybody shared when you were growing up.
What do you think about, I don't know if this is the right term, intellectual discrimination? The thought of those who would consider themselves to be an intellectual, or the more educated over the less educated, the less educated over the educated. Because sometimes I think that there is a bit of a people want to just discredit those that are educated because it doesn't fit their views. But then sometimes I feel as that on the other end as well, in that you're unwilling to listen to somebody if they're not educated. People are sometimes unwilling to listen to somebody if they're not educated. How do we better balance that?
I think that happens all the time. And my first guess was that you were going to talk about discrimination against less educated people. And you noted the reverse direction first. But I think, sort of like going along with what I said earlier about sort of decreasing overconfidence as a way to become more open-minded. It's our society sort of, I think, glorifies education as a way to get closer to being an expert on things or being right about things. So I think that it becomes easy for people who are well educated to sort of argue that they have more claim to what is right or what is true. Basically I think that's a load of BS. Like, I think through the process of education, I don't think education is useless. Certainly, obviously, I have spent a lot of time and money on education. But it gives you a different framework to think about the world, and it introduces all of its own biases as well. So I think education is just one other domain where people have different experiences and different biases and different perspectives. And I'm not sure that they should be privileged in one direction or the other.
I think, to me, when I think about it, I think I always try to respect those that have spent more time thinking about working on and studying something than I have. That doesn't necessarily mean they have to be educated in something. I can talk more about how a radio broadcast works than most. And that should be somewhat looked at, okay, this person knows more about this than I do.
Right.
That, to me, is a bigger measurement than necessarily the person's education into something. But I do think that sometimes we do have a bit of, I worry that sometimes we've gotten a little too much into false equivalency on things. I think false equivalency has come out now more than ever before on things, because I don't know. I don't know what the solution for when to talk and when to listen. We have a lot of, we have had all of our lives, years and years and years of being told that we are smart and beautiful and think about you and you are a magical unicorn built from stardust, and I think sometimes then we start to lose the ability to listen as well as we hear. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, listening is much harder than it seems, I think. And I think it is hard it might be impossible to not privilege our own experiences and perspectives. Maybe the best that you can hope for is sort of entertaining the perspectives of other people, sort of in as good faith as possible. But I think I have to run.
Oh, shoot. Okay.
I'm sorry.
No worries. Well, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for speaking with us. Just one quick question. Anything that you would leave people with to read, listen to, or watch that you think would be of value to help be more open-minded?
Read, listen to, or watch. Let's see. I don't know. This is not a specific thing. It's a general thing, but something by someone who you think is smart, who has a different view than you.
Fair enough. Perfect. All right, Alexa, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for joining me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. Really, thank you for the conversation. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much. I had a great time.
Thanks.